I'll just keep watching for if anybody else joins us. But everybody, this is Jodi St Aubin. She has been in education for 14 years, an educator for much of that, and then became a school counselor for the last 5. So today she's going to talk to us about navigating school accommodations and sort of preparing for conversations or having those, admitting more people, around navigating conversations around developing the right plan for school accommodations. But also, I like to say that these conversations, while right now it's sort of couched in the widget of school, these conversations happen throughout our lives, right? With bosses and higher ed and even our own families. So I think that while this is about navigating school, this conversation is going to be good for everybody. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jodi and let her take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lauren. As Lauren said, I'm Jodi St Aubin. Super excited to present today. I can't believe that it is June already. I'm going to be clicking through my slides, and don't mind if I'm looking at my notes once in a while. I don't have my notes on my screen, so I might be flipping a little bit. But if you have any questions or any ahas, any wonderings that you want to share along the way, please don't hesitate to just blurt out or to raise your hand, get my attention somehow, and I'll be sure to pause for those things. So yes, talking about navigating school accommodations, we'll share some technical things like 504, IEP, and more, but really focusing more on that mindset and stuff at the end too of how to approach those conversations and really navigate that team approach. So click over here. Okay, so kind of 3 big things. I just will start with a little bit of just sharing some of my own personal background, my professional background, and my CLOVES connection. Then kind of leaning into tiered level of supports, including things like a 504 and maybe an IEP. There's lots of things on the spectrum of what supports can look like in the school setting. And then also that power of advocacy as a parent, as a caregiver, as a person yourself, whatever that role is for you. And then also just a really positive team mindset. So how do you really navigate that team approach and be really a united front, whether it's with you and your team members or for your child and their team members, and what that can kind of look like. So just a little bit about me. So I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. I was born with CLOVES syndrome. At the time, they did not know that that's what it was. And actually, I was quite a surprise at birth. They didn't do many ultrasounds back then. And my mom had one ultrasound early on, as my older sisters are twins, and they just wanted to confirm that she wasn't having a multiple again. And that really didn't catch anything. So it wasn't until I was born, I was quite a surprise. I was pretty fortunate to doctor at some bigger places in Wisconsin, including Madison and Children's in Milwaukee throughout my childhood. But my diagnoses really changed throughout the years. Initially, they weren't quite sure, eventually kind of landed on Banny and Riley syndrome. Later, even into my adult life, I had a diagnosis of Proteus syndrome. And it wasn't until about a year ago in doctoring with Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, that I have my official diagnosis and finally proven with labs and all of that good stuff too. So that's been very exciting for me. But just a little bit about my connection to CLOVES and to this community. So I just wanted to take a moment to share that. And about me now, so now I live in Appleton, Wisconsin. This is some of my family. I have 3 beautiful, healthy girls. They are 8, 6, and will be 3 in July. And my husband and I just love doing things with them. Our world really revolves around them right now, and lots of fun family outings and trying to just really stay active and enjoy our time together. So we have been really blessed with them. We did have to navigate some fertility help with my own medical and CLOVES things, but we're incredibly grateful for that team of doctors and that whole world. And being able to have our 3 daughters together was really just such a blessing. So, and then professionally, so as Lauren said, I started out as a teacher. I taught 3rd grade for 9 years. And I decided to go back to school. At that time, my education degree was actually in early childhood education from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. I went back to school to earn my Master of Arts degree in school counseling through Lakeland University. This is a picture of the team that I work with now. So this is actually just from a few weeks ago. And just to get an idea, maybe too, of who might be on a school team for yourself or your child. So you can see myself, obviously, the school counselor. Next to me with the gold, the fun fanny pack is our youth advocate. A youth advocate is kind of a support staff member that works with all the kids in the school. They're just a very loved and fun person, but they get to do lots of tier 1 and tier 2 type supports, which we'll get into a little bit later. Not all school districts have a youth advocate, and some school districts might call it a student advocate, or they might have different names for it, but we have a youth advocate. In the middle, that gentleman is our school social worker. So school social workers do a lot more of kind of supporting that bridge from family to home. So families that might need some support with different things, whether that's food, housing, just navigating different things like that. That's where our social worker kind of comes in. And then next to him, our school psychologist. A school psychologist really plays a tremendous role with all the supports, including all those legal things like the IEP and the 504. They really man all of that. So I work very closely with our school psychologists, very skilled people, and they do a lot of that more technical side of things with evaluations and IEPs, and work closely with special education teachers. And then far left is our dean of students. Again, not all school districts or schools have a dean of students. Ours does. And so our dean of students supports more of the behavior side of things in a school setting and helps support our administration. So lots of staff members in a school now, I feel like, even more so than when I was younger, that really help support like the whole child, beyond teachers and support staff, which are also phenomenal, and principals, but there's a lot more staff that kind of make up the inner part of a school. So just a little bit about the school that I have been with. I've actually been with on my whole career. We are a school-wide Title I school. So that means more than 50% of our students or families are free and reduced or low income. So I work with a lot of families and students that have that low income background, but then also lots of trauma background, low SES things, and just kind of a high need school. We also have a very high special education population, with actually about 35% of our school is special education. And that can range in all different categories, from behavioral to cognitive to all sorts of things that we'll get into in a little bit. So just a little bit about that. All right. And I did just want to share kind of a disclaimer, but supports really vary by school and by funding. So I am coming from the lens of a public school in Wisconsin, but that will really depend on different things for where you are, and if it's a public or a private setting. So just kind of like a disclaimer. So that can vary from school to school. Most of my slides, again, are going to come from that public school lens. Private schools are a little bit different, and private schools are not legally required to provide special education services, and they don't have to follow public school individualized education plans or IEPs. But some private schools may still offer accommodations, and oftentimes they partner with the local public school district to provide some of those services. So our school psychologist actually visits some of our parochial schools and can do evaluating and things like that. But the private school doesn't have to follow those same legal things. So that kind of depends on the needs of your family, but just to kind of understand that a little bit. And then, of course, like I said, I'm coming from a public school lens in Wisconsin, but some of that would depend on things like local context, internal policy, and then what types of programs are available within that school setting. So just wanted to share that. And if there's questions about that as we go, please let me know. In general, though, I wanted to start with this as we kind of launch into this a little bit. It's very common in school systems really across the United States and even throughout the world that follow this type of approach, that this tiered approach. So you can see a pyramid there. Tier 1 is like that general core instruction. That is something all students get. Tier 2 is a little bit more targeted, and then Tier 3 might be some more intensive interventions. I think it's really important to know know though that in that tier 1, kids can still get so many supports within that, from their teacher, from roles like a student advocate, a school counselor. I support a ton of students in different ways that aren't necessarily a special education student. A lot of that is just kind of built into how we do school now, which is really neat. It's not just an academic focus either, but kind of fits into some of those other social emotional pieces and things like that too. And you also know that each student is unique. So it will really depend on yourself or your child as the student, that we know that we are all unique, and that might really vary depending on the student and where their needs are. Me personally, as a person with CLOVES, I actually didn't have really any additional school supports going through the school system when I was younger. This was back like in the in the 90s, early 2000s. In high school, I did have some challenges with attendance just due to medical appointments and things like that, but never really anything that required an IEP or required any formal support. I definitely utilized my school counselor and things in high school, but just wanted to kind of share that that was able to be managed just within my own family and with my high school counselor. So it's really student specific, that even if you have CLOVES or have different things like that, it doesn't mean that you need the same types of supports at school. You might or you might not. It's just really individualized to each student. Okay. Just another glance at that tier 1. So we looked at that little colored one. I just wanted to share this. I know the font is kind of small. Don't worry about reading it, but I just wanted to share those percentages. So within a school, generally, and again, this is kind of across most schools that use this approach, we say about 80% of students are sufficient in tier 1. So that whatever the universal programming is, the universal academic lessons, social emotional supports, mental health supports, 80% of students find success with that, and they don't need anything beyond that. Then we say about tier 2, about 15% of those students need a little bit extra. So they still get all of those tier 1 supports. None of that ever goes away, but then they get some of that little bit extra boost. And then about 5% of students in a population would require some intensive individual instruction, or that's where that IEP kind of comes in. And that really varies on schools too. You heard me say earlier that I work at a pretty high need school, so our percentage is actually quite a bit higher than that. Our triangle's a little bit bigger at the top, but just wanted to really share that. It's kind of dependent on the student and their different needs. Okay, so just some ideas of kind of that tier navigation and support. So again, that general core construction. So that's what happens in every regular ed classroom that teachers do with the different adults that support that, whether that's reading coaches, math coaches, school counselors, youth advocates. Tier 1 is sufficient for lots of students. Successful progress often means that you don't really need any further special education intervention. There can also be supports just within tier 1. So I do a lot of just check-ins with kids, small counseling groups, different things. If, you know, there's high anxiety and maybe getting to school in the morning is hard, or we need a little bit of a soft start in the morning. All of that can happen really within tier 1. So there doesn't have to be any legal or formal steps that kind of happen to get some of those supports. Just really depends on communication and you communicating with the school team or with the teacher of what that looks like. So successful tier 2, again, tier 2 wouldn't be an IEP or special education, but a lot of students just can be supported successfully at tier 2 without that IEP. I listed some of these supports already, but these could be maybe a little bit above just what every kid is kind of receiving. So some of that one-on-one counseling with a school counselor, small group counseling, those can be for a variety of topics. So we do them for self-esteem, for family change, for just navigating different things, transitioning to different grades, anxiety, anger management, like navigating feelings, identifying feelings. Those can be, there's a wide variety of topics that school counselors can do small counseling groups on, which is really neat. That's a little bit more of a peer opportunity. So kids can work with other kids that are having the same challenges, sometimes kids from other grade levels. Another support that we utilize a lot are peer mentors. So if there are just little times of the day that a student needs a little bit of an extra extra check-ins, sometimes just checking in with an older kid, making just an intentional partnership with somebody throughout the day that can check in, maybe set a goal for the day with them, take a little break, whatever that need might be. There's things like check in, check out, which is a daily chart where students kind of, if maybe their struggle's a little bit more attention focus based, they can kind of monitor, help build their self-awareness a little bit of how they're doing throughout the day, a little bit more one-on-one check-in with the teacher throughout the day, and a mentor usually is connected to that as well. There's things like self-monitoring charts, and the list goes on and on and on. But I just really wanted to share that there can be so many supports that are in that tier 2 level. So what a classroom teacher is able to do, and sometimes what a school counselor or somebody else is able to kind of layer on with that. At my school, we utilize something called a student support plan. That's one of those things too. It might just be called a different thing depending on what district or what school you're at. In the past, they've been called student support teams or just support plans. A student support plan for us is just really a little bit more of a formal process of a team coming together with the student and their family to document all of those supports that they have. So if it's not an IEP or special education, but it's just all the things the classroom teacher is doing plus a little bit more, sometimes it's helpful to document those things and just kind of check in. So in addition to like parent-teacher conferences, we would check in a few more times a year just to see what supports are in place or interventions are in place, if they're working, what's successful. We talk a lot about what are the strengths of the students. It's really strength-based. And then what are some of those challenge areas that we can kind of help support. So documenting or having it documented in something like a student support plan can be helpful, I think, for the family too, just to have that formal documentation. So if you're having more conversation with doctors or providers, therapists outside of school, whatever that might be, you can kind of share that snapshot of how things are looking at school. And then I think especially helpful in transition years. So when our older students transition to middle school, when middle schoolers transition to high school and so on, to have kind of a document that follows that can be pretty helpful. So I'm going to pause for just a moment, and I'm talking pretty fast. Any questions or any wondering so far that anybody has?
Jodi, I was curious to know, and now I'm wondering if this is just a thing that we do use at our school. Is a 504, is that an across the board thing? And is that a tier 2, if so?
That's a great question. So 504 is, I'd say, pretty much across the board. It is a little bit more formalized than those tier 2 things I was just talking about, in that it is a legal document. So this, like the student support plan, say I'm the case manager for it, the teacher's on the team, the family's on the team, maybe the school psych or the administrator's on the team, and we're all just following it. But it is not a legal, it's not a legal document that anybody's legally required to follow it. Hopefully you have a good team and we are all following it. But, and that actually makes me think too, I know earlier I was talking about the different team members. I think just really taking comfort in, these are so often, these are people that are just really passionate about working with kids and supporting children and supporting even adults too. Most people don't go into public education for the money, but really have like a passion for it and for helping. So usually, I mean, hopefully sometimes there's bad apples everywhere, but hopefully you really feel that comfort in a team, that even if it's not a legal document, that everything's kind of being followed and it feels good.
Cool,
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. I just was thinking, I was like, oh, I wonder where that falls.
Yeah, I will get into that a little bit more too. Okay. Okay. So beyond tier 1, so if a student does require support beyond that general classroom or that tier 1, a collaborative team process usually begins. Just helping that along the way is, of course, that continued family connection. So just ongoing dialogue, updates, really partnering with the family and the guardian. So always emailing the teacher, connecting with the school counselor, just kind of connecting the dots. And I actually say that connecting the dots a lot. I feel like myself as a school counselor, I school psychologists, social workers, that's a lot of our job, is connecting dots between what's going on with the kid, the family, and then even outside providers and supports too. So that is always something that's highly encouraged. We're not mind readers. So if there's something that you're wondering about for your kid at school or for yourself at school, just advocating, being really open about that and about how the supports are working if there's a support that's started. After that, continued family connection, and that's getting started. Then usually we'd pull together to do some of that collaborative brainstorming. That can be, like I mentioned before, some diverse team members, and maybe they're looking at data, just generating new support ideas. So that could include the school counselor, school psychologist, some of those different roles, the administrator, always the teacher. And then that tier 2 intervention. So I listed what some of those are, but like, let's get together, all sit at the same table. You know your child best. The child, if they're older, they know themselves best. So what is it that we can help support? What is it that we can kind of rally around a little bit? So just kind of coming together, it's kind of just how that process can kind of start. So that continued communication. Oftentimes I will be the one to offer that to our families, but again, I'm in the elementary setting, so school is new for our families yet. So I would be the one to invite them in for a student support plan or an SSP, but just know, always asking like, hey, I'm wondering about this, or we've started some of these supports. Can we get together and document it? Just asking things like that if nobody has brought it up to you before that. But that's just kind of how that collaborative process begins. So if there's anything that's needed a little bit beyond that tier 1, it really a team approach, I think, is what really gets everything going. I think I mentioned this just a little bit, but really tapping into those resources too, myself and a school social worker, if you are ever interested in like community resources, whether that's therapy, outside therapy, play therapy, just different things in the community. Oftentimes the people at school know what those different places are or have worked with families that have had positive experiences at different places. And those are just great people to ask for feedback. So a lot of my students, if I recommend a different outside therapist and they're connected there, we do things like sign release of information forms. So then I can communicate with the school therapist. We can get on the same page with supports. If there's certain language or, vocabulary that they're learning in therapy that we can mirror at school, those things can be really helpful too. So just wanted to throw that in there. Okay. And then beyond tier 2. So if, we talked about all these supports already of if, lots of things can just be within the regular classroom, and teachers are phenomenal and magical people. And here are all the things they're already doing. And maybe we've added some more tier 2. Maybe there's some supports from the school counselor, some from some other school staff, and maybe you've come together to document that in something. And then if we're noticing, so we're coming together and we're noticing that we're not really maintaining meaningful progress with that consistent tier 2, the collaborative team can kind of take a few different approaches. So of course, we'd want that continued family connection and student data. But if we're noticing that minimal progress, you could at that time, and that really depends on the family's desires as well, but analyze that intervention data and determine, do we want to look at something called the 504, which Lauren mentioned, or special education and evaluation for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit next just about the difference between those things. I think that's very common, especially at the elementary school where families are new to school, that we're not sure what are those things and kind of what are our options. And it sounds like a lot of jargon. So just kind of talking through that a little bit. So understanding your options, the support menu. There's also something, I didn't have this before, but depending on your needs or your students' needs, maybe it is just more medical things. I did not have her in the picture, but we have a school nurse at our school as well. School nurses are wonderful people. They're often, ours is shared between buildings, so they're sometimes a little bit harder to access, but school nurses can be a tremendous team member for things like this as well, and they can help develop things called IHPs or individual health plans. So those would be things that are written by the school nurse. They outline specific medical interventions. I know these aren't like CLOVES specific, but just some different things that I have listed there, like, blood sugar monitoring or things with seizure protocols. It isn't a legal document, but it is like a formal nursing document. And then just to note too, this IHP, a child could have this and a 504 or an IEP simultaneously. So the IHP or the health plan just really handles how to treat a medical flare-up, while the 504 we'll talk about that gives a little bit more of like, if there was this, then what's the academic support that comes during that. So IHPs can be really helpful. Classroom teachers and teachers are phenomenal, but they aren't nurses necessarily. So just kind of getting things documented so everybody knows how to best support the student. this reminds me too, IHPs and things like those student support plans typically get shared out with family permission with all the staff that would work with that student. So this would get shared out with their physical education teacher, with their music teacher, with their art teacher. If they're in their older grades, with the science teacher and the math teacher, and their debate teacher, things like that. So it just kind of gets shared out with everybody so we can all be on the same page of what those supports look like for that student. Okay, then getting into that 504 versus IEP a little bit. So when you think of those two terms and what they mean, so 504 thinks a little bit more about access, and IEP thinks about services. So it's a little bit of a heftier thing. Both can be phenomenal. It both depends on the need for the student. So a 504 plan does a little bit more, I'd say the lens is like that removing the barriers to learning through accommodation. So like getting equal access. And then the IEP thinks about services. So are there additional supports that a student needs beyond what the teacher can provide? So does a special education teacher, an adaptive phys ed teacher, are there different people that need to get on the student's team to provide some of those supports? And I'm going to share a little bit more about this too, as I know this is probably clear as mud right now. But here's just a quick little snapshot too, kind of the difference between a 504 and an IEP. So that 504 is more about giving that equal access, where the IEP provides specialized instruction and services, which is a little bit different. So beyond the instruction that the teacher would provide, somebody else would be providing some instruction. A 504 provides more accommodations, where an IEP can provide accommodations plus services, academic services, OT services, speech and language services, things like that. They are both legal documents. So the 504 plan is like through the rehabilitation, oh, I cannot say that word right now, through that act, where the IEP is through the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then that just kind of gets into what that could look like a little bit. But what I think is really most helpful is this little analogy. So it says, think of a 504 like a ramp into the school building. It ensures that the student can get through the door and participate, where the IEP is like a specialized tour that would guide the student through the building. It changes the actual path and tools that the student uses to understand the material. And obviously we're not talking about a physical, well, you could be, but we're not talking about a physical ramp or map in most cases, but really that idea of accommodations to help the student access the instruction that the teacher is giving, or the content that the teacher, whatever is happening in the classroom from the teacher. A 504 helps them access that, whatever that, if that's anxiety related, mental health, medical related, whatever it might be. Where the IEP helps them access that, and it helps change what they're actually given. So they might receive additional instruction, additional services. Okay. Is it still clear as mud? Does that make a little bit more sense? Okay. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Okay. I did want to share too, oftentimes, again, I work with younger students and families, and if we don't know, I have had families just be like, well, I think they need an IEP. And we haven't done any tier 2, or they're not really struggling at tier 1 yet. So I think it's just important to know that if a student does qualify for an IEP, which I'll get into what that process, how you get there, what that looks like next. But legally, the different disability categories under the IDEA have to be through these 13. So most things that we know of, even CLOVES, could fit into one of these 13, absolutely. But I just wanted to kind of share that. So legally, when the school psychologist and the school team has to determine if they meet the requirements for an IEP, they have to fit into one of these categories. So you see everything from autism, emotional behavior things, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, other health impairments, specific learning disabilities, things like that. I'd say the most common that we typically see, or that I work with, are that OHI, because that just covers a lot. Other health impairment, a lot of attention focus things can fall under that. Anxiety can fall under OHI. And then we also have, of course, we support kiddos that have more intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities. And then emotional, it's like listed as emotional disturbance, but some that would qualify for emotional or behavioral needs. But there are 13 total. Autism is another big one in special education. But just wanted to kind of share that if that's what we're looking at, eventually we'd have to figure out which one of those matches, if it does match, to make sure that that's really the right step for that kiddo. Okay, I'm gonna rewind a little bit. So we talked about if you have tier one, you have some tier one, so now some tier two supports, and we're noticing that's not quite enough yet. At that time, an evaluation would occur. So a family can request an evaluation for a special education referral at any time. I always say, like, be in great communication with your school team before that, because we really want to know the child and know what are we going to be evaluating for before we do that process. So I wouldn't just out of the blue, I think they need an evaluation, but that's like really following that communication in that process. And then a school team, a teacher, a counselor, social worker, as any staff member can also request an evaluation for a student at any time. That is everybody's legal right. So an evaluation, that is the testing that occurs. So if we're realizing these supports aren't working, and whether it's supporting academic or mental health or medical things, whatever it might be, this isn't really working, we would then do an evaluation. So the school psychologist is the one that does that. And they are qualified to do testing for lots of different categories. So depending on, again, it's best to kind of be in communication so we know what kinds of tests should they do to make sure we can really identify what the needs are. So an evaluation would occur. So the school psychologist would work with that student and go through a variety of tests. I actually have our school psychologist quoted on the bottom here. She is famous for saying the parent is in the driver's seat the whole time. So there's nothing that happens without parent permission, even through high school years. Parents are really in the driver's seat the entire time. So they have to give permission for testing. So if the school is the one that says, hey, I think we should do an evaluation and learn more about this, learn more about the student, learn more about you, figure out what it is that we can do to best support you, the parent has to give permission for that to happen. A school can't do an evaluation without that parent permission. So that's where her quote comes from. You're really in the driver's seat the entire time. So after the evaluation, and that can take a few weeks, depends on what type of testing they're doing, where the needs are, then that team would come back together to review the results. So looking through the data, the school psychologist does a really beautiful job of just explaining all the really technical things to the rest of us and to the family of what do these results mean? What do the different testing results mean? And then to qualify for an IEP, the IEP is that legal document or an individualized education plan. To qualify for that, the team must agree on two things. And this is really outlined. There would be, paper things you're checking off and signing as you go. But the team must agree on two things: that one, the child has one of those officially recognized disabilities. So one of those 13. Does something that they have fall within one of those 13? Do they have one of those? And that disability directly gets in the way of their ability to learn. So some students can have ADHD, which fits under OHI, but it really doesn't get in the way of their learning. It really depends on the student and what it is. So oftentimes I'd say it does result in that both of those things go together, but just wanted to share that when that team comes together, then you're reviewing all of that and you're answering those two questions. Do they have that disability? And does that get in the way of their ability to learn or to access the learning? So if the child qualifies, then the team, which includes the family, would meet again to write the actual IEP document. So that's a whole separate thing. Again, the parent in the driver's seat the whole time. So even if a child qualifies for special education and for an IEP, the parent has to give permission for the school to write that and to do that. So the IEP document will outline what their specific goals are, what services they might receive, and then any accommodations. And then once the parent signs off on it, then it goes into action. So again, that quote, that parent is in the driver's seat the whole time. So it's really, really that team approach focused on what's going to be best for that specific person. With this, I did want to share too, kind of a sidebar, but related, just the inclusion model. So I mentioned before, as somebody who went to elementary school in the 90s, school looks a bit different today, and I think that's really exciting. So my idea of special education or students that had an IEP when I was growing up was often students that were pulled out of the room. They worked in a different room. We maybe saw them at lunch. We maybe saw them at recess, but we weren't always with them. They weren't mixed among the rest of the peers, right? And I didn't have these supports, but I knew, right, some of the kids that had some learning troubles or that had some behavior things, but they weren't kind of mixed in with everybody, which we've learned, thankfully, is not best practice. So majority of schools, I'd say across our nation and across anybody following that tier approach, really follows what's called the inclusion model. So the inclusion model is just what it sounds like. It's all about being inclusive and including. So the special education students are learning right alongside their peers in a general education classroom with the necessary supports brought to them. So if their IP identifies that they need, one-on-one instruction in the area of math for 15 minutes daily, and then they need ELA instruction, it's brought right to them. So a special education teacher would partner with that general education teacher and push right into the classroom, and those supports are right in the classroom where everybody is, which is really cool. So instead of separating into those different rooms, this just ensures we learn all together. There are times, of course, where that's not used, and that can vary. We have this at my school as well. So if a student just can't make that meaningful academic or social process, so oftentimes these may be students with significant cognitive delays, things like Down syndrome, significant autism, things like that. Like they're just not going to get their needs met in that classroom. Then sometimes there's pull-out spaces or classrooms for that. Even then, a lot of times they're joining classes for community circle, for recess, for things like that. Or like if that's social progress. So that could include big academic gaps, things like life needs. So if there's some of those cognitive things like bathrooming and things like that. And then also significant behavioral. So one of the qualifying things is that EBD, or emotional behavioral disability. So if their behaviors are unsafe or are a challenge for the safety of themselves and others, then sometimes their supports might be provided in a different setting. But I say most of the time, it's really has that inclusion model approach. And oftentimes we have parents that are really worried about that, right? That had a similar school experience to what I did. And I don't want them to be separate from their peers, and I don't want them to be pulled out. Oftentimes they're not. And that just goes to that communication part. If you're wondering about that or have questions about that, and what will this actually look like for my child, a day in the life, if this is you, as a teenager, what will this actually mean for my day in the life? What does that mean from period to period as I go from class to class? What does it really look like? Asking things like that. In that inclusion model, I kind of mentioned this, but co-teaching is a very big thing. So that general education teacher and special education teacher working together, they share the instruction, they partner with that shared environment. So just getting to be in the same space. And then tailored supports, they can still receive some of those supports and accommodations outlined in their IEP. Maybe that's things like extra time on tests or things like that, but they can do that right alongside their classmates, which is really a beautiful thing. Why schools use it. So why did we learn that this is best practice? I think two big parts. I think about everybody. So for students with special needs, it can really help boost social skills, build confidence. It really keeps their academic expectations high. And then they are, of course, a part of that school community rather than being stigmatized. And then for general education students, I think of my peers growing up, it teaches empathy, it teaches patience, it teaches acceptance, and acceptances of differences, whether those are physical differences or learning differences, just from a really early age, which is beautiful. And we know, I think always, like, kids are the most inclusive by nature. So we're really just helping channel that a little bit, which I think is really neat. So just a touch on that. And then with the IEP, so LRE, or least restrictive environment, this is by law, this kind of fits into that inclusion model legally. So under the IDEA Act, schools must place students in the least restrictive learning environment. So always a good thing to ask questions about. So you say they're getting support in reading, where will that be? Or I need some extra help in math, where am I going to get my support in math? Am I in the classroom with my peers? Do I want to be with my peers? Do I need a separate setting for that? But legally, schools have to do the LRE, or the least restrictive environment. So this means full inclusion is always the starting goal. And then, of course, there are sometimes where that isn't the best option for that kiddo or for the safety of others too. So you kind of provide like a continuum of services to find a more restrictive but more appropriate setting. But just wanted to share that in addition to being best practice, it's a legal part of an IEP as well. I keep talking about IEP, and I mentioned this, I think, when we talked about kind of coming together as as a team, but an IEP, that acronym is used a lot, and sometimes people mean the meeting, sometimes people mean the actual plan. The IEP is the actual plan. So it's a legally binding blueprint that's designed for a school-age child who qualifies for special education. So after that team would determine, yep, they meet that disability, and yes, they need additional support because of it, the IEP is then written by an IEP team. That is usually the special education teacher that writes the IEP, partnering with a general education teacher and the school psychologist and the other team members and the family. But they're the ones who write it. So the IEP is, again, a legal document. It's kind of that blueprint, and it details what are going to be the different accommodating goals or the different academic goals, and like what will that student learning look like? What will those special services be? Those things could be things like speech therapy, and I'll share some of those things next too. So how often does an IEP team meet? So I'd say some of those, back to when we were talking about tier 1 and tier 2, that can really ebb and flow depending on your needs, on your family's needs, your students' needs. I've met as often as monthly with families or just once or twice a year. It really depends on what the needs are. If it is an IEP, again, that's the legal document by law. The IEP team must meet at least once a year for an annual review, and then they evaluate the progress and create a new plan for the upcoming period. And then the team can meet as often as needed. So you can always request an additional meeting with your team, and schools will work to make that happen. But then every 3 years, the team comes together again to determine if a reevaluation is needed. So that's important to know, I think, especially if you're younger or if you have a younger child and they're qualifying for special education in a younger grade, like 2nd or 4th grade. It doesn't mean they are forever labeled special education and they forever have an IEP. That is reviewed every year. And then every 3 years, they'll determine if they need to be reevaluated. So every 3 years, do they need to get evaluated by the school psychologist again? Do we need to look at where their needs are, where their growth has been, what they need now? And at any time, by request, parents or staff can, again, asked to come together with the IEP team, and staff has to make that happen. So, but I just wanted to share that. So even if a child does have an IEP, it doesn't mean they have that forever. We even have 4th grade students, 5th grade students that get dismissed from special education if they are making progress. I always think of, like, you know, my middle child just recently learned how to bike without training wheels. She didn't need the training wheels. Why keep them on, right? It's the same in schools, in the school setting. If they don't need the supports, you don't need to keep them. Let them go on their own. So if they don't need the training wheels, you can let them go. And sometimes in those younger years, they might need the training wheels. They might need some school supports for a bit longer, but it doesn't mean that they have them forever. And I think that's just really a good thing to remember. And then also it can be the opposite too, right? Where as a child, I got along just fine in elementary school. It wasn't until high school that I had some more attendance things and I had to work with my school counselor more. So kind of the opposite, but just knowing that that can really change in a lifespan, and it doesn't mean an IEP is forever. What kind of supports are there? So I keep talking about like an IEP, and then they're going to determine what supports there are and what interventions there are. They can really be covered a wide variety of things. So everything from academic, math, reading, physical and health, social, emotional, behavioral, life skills, things like bathrooming, job skills, things like that, and then related therapies. So an occupational therapist, a speech and language therapist, a physical therapist, things like that can all be tied into the support that a child might need through an IEP, or different things that are available. I'll go over this kind of quick. This is just a little bit more technical, but if it's those academic supports and instruction, like they could look at accommodations. So do they need just extra times on tests? Do they need some breaks? Do they need to sit at the front of the room? Do they need text to speech on their Chromebook or on their device? And modifications or even specialized instruction. So that's where that special education teacher might provide one-on-one or small group lessons just with that student. That can come in handy if the learning gap is a little bit bigger. So they're in a 3rd grade classroom, but they're at like a 1st grade level in math. Then a special education teacher can provide that 1st grade instruction to the student. Physical and environmental needs, that can just be things like accessibility. Schools hopefully are all up to date with those things, but if there's anything different that they need, and then medical or health management. So working with that school nurse. I know I shared before that, like, for instance, our school nurse is shared between buildings. She's just our only registered nurse, but most schools have like a school health aide, somebody else that can help with some of those supports if they need more frequent visits or just a safer space to rest throughout the day, snack, water, things like that. And then social emotional, that could look like counseling services with the school counselor, social skills groups, things like that. Just some of those different supports that could happen throughout their school day. Behavioral supports, that would be, it again depends on the student's needs, but another acronym there, the BIP, a behavior intervention plan. So that's more of a formal plan within the IEP. If a struggle is behavior, of how is staff going to react to behavior, how are we going to approach behavior, and just really outlining that so everybody's on the same page. Could be things like sensory breaks or just visual schedules. It can really be a lot of things. I just listed a few there. And then life skills and independence, executive functioning, just daily living skills, hygiene, navigating the cafeteria, using money. That can really change, especially as students get into high school, and some of those like more practicing in the community, using the bus system, things like that. And then self-advocacy can be a life skill as well, and just teaching, how do you as a student advocate for your needs and what it is that you need. And then related therapies, I mentioned these, but things like speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and then even transition services. So that's for a higher age group, but when students get into high school, or that age range 14 to 16, that can look like things for planning after school and for independent living, and what that might be. Okay, I'm going to pause again. Any questions that anybody has with all the 504, IEP, accommodations, all of that? Okay. Okay, switching gears a little bit then, so a little bit less technical, but I mentioned before just really that power of mindset and positive and being collaborative. So really keeping that positive mindset, whether it's for yourself or as the parent with a child, just believing in growth and in solutions, and a really strong focus on strengths and progress goes a long way. I think that children see that and they hear that and they sense it, and they will pick up on those same things that you are modeling. So a positive mindset goes a tremendous way for staff, for parents, for families, and really just modeling that for our kiddos, that is really powerful. And then collaboration, I talked about that a lot, but really just that unified team. So being a united front. Really not wanting to get into the school versus home and we're doing this, right? We don't want that. And as much as we can sit at the same table with that child, with you, if are the one needing support, and talking through those things, I think it's just really important that children and that all of us view that as a really unified team and a unified front. So at home, we know that they support us, and at school, I know that I'm supported, and that my home backs what school is doing. My home backs what my teacher is doing. That is just really, really powerful and goes a long way. All of the supports and all of the things on paper are only so much without that positive mindset and that collaboration behind it. And then just knowing it is always an open space to share ideas, to listen. You are the expert on you. You are the expert on your child. And just sharing those ideas, asking questions, listening, just kind of keeping that collaboration going, because it needs to be a whole team approach for the kid, for you. That is just really, really helpful. So keeping that in mind, that the school is your team members. So they're not working against you. They're on the team with you. And thankfully, like I said before, I think so many people that go into education already have that mindset and want that. Just making sure you find the right people. I always say as well, if you are finding that this doesn't feel like the right person, then talking to other people about that. So whether that's the administrator or somebody that works in the district, but just making sure you have the right people for your kid, and trusting your gut with some of those things. And then for our students, just a network support for long-term success. So again, I think school staff can really tap into some of those community resources when you get to high school and beyond. What does that look like? Just kind of connecting all of those dots. So really using the knowledge that's there and tapping into that resource can be really helpful. And then partnering for your child's success. So how do you do that, right? So we talk about be collaborative and be a united team. Well, how do you do that? What's the nitty gritty there? So I feel like approaching those school meetings with a collaborative mindset is just one of the most powerful things that you can do for yourself or for your child. Think of yourself and the school staff not as opposing sides, but as that unified team with the same goal, helping them thrive. So I often say, like, we are a team. If it's me, we're Team Jodi. We're all here for Team Jodi today. We're all on this kid's team, and how do we help them? But just really having that right mindset, I think, especially in IEP meetings and school team meetings, it depends on your child's age, but oftentimes they can be right at the table and they are going to pick up on how we're talking and our body language and our mannerisms and all of that. So just really being open to that, being able to ask questions and listen and share and all that good stuff. The master of the school advocacy. So how do you approach that? I kind of shared some of these things already, but some more like actual things that you can pick up and do. Keeping a dedicated binder, I think, is really helpful. I have a binder for myself, but just keeping, because if you have CLOVES or if you have a child of CLOVES, you likely have a lot of medical specialists and people that you're seeing too. And just keeping that all together in a binder and then being able to bring that to school meetings, I think, can be really helpful too. So keeping your meeting notes, your medical letters, just kind of keeping it all together. Schools really thrive and need that documentation to be able to provide some of those supports. So just kind of keeping it all there. Put everything in writing. So I like email everything, then it's like documented that you request an evaluation or that there's a meeting scheduled. That can be really helpful. Schools do have a legal timeline they have to follow. So after request for an evaluation is made, there's a certain number of days that they have to get that permission for, and then a certain window that they have to complete the testing in, all of that. So just kind of, if you are a date calendar person, that might help to kind of get that in writing. And then assume that positive intent. I really hope that the school people that you are working with are those great people that really want you or your child to succeed. But there's also, we're managing large workloads at times. So we're at a school of almost 500 and I'm the only school counselor. So just keeping that in mind, that some of these administrators, school psychologists, counselors might have a lot of kids and families that they're supporting. So just knowing, reach out if you didn't hear back from that question, things like that. Don't ever be afraid to reach out and advocate. And then approaching those meetings more collaborative, like let's brainstorm together, right? Versus that you versus us. And then involve your child. I mentioned that, but when that's age appropriate, it really depends on your child too and your comfort level with that. But even middle schoolers can talk about, what helps or hurts and being able to articulate those things as well as elementary kids. And then just knowing that accommodations only work if the kid is willing to use them. So we can put lots of beautiful things in place, but if the kid also isn't on board on, yeah, I would do that, or I'm comfortable doing that, I would use that, it's not going to go very far. So sometimes involving those in some of those early conversations and decisions can be really, really helpful. That medical, I talked about this, the binder, but I just wanted to share again, just specific letters. So if there is something specific that you're hoping a school can provide support for, just having that letter from the doctor. So there's an example there. Instead of like, Jordan has this, he has this, and this is what he needs because of it, and having doctors help back that. So schools really thrive on documentation. They can't legally or ethically even provide things without medical backing. So that can be really helpful. And final thoughts. Okay. Just wanted to kind of share that by blending the school's educational expertise. So use the people, right? They're trained in these things and know these things. And then with your deep knowledge of your child or yourself, you can really create a supportive network that sets your kiddo up for success or yourself up for success. I think it's helpful too to tap into, sometimes if you have a child with CLOVES or if it's you that you're advocating for, you are the only one like that or maybe yours is the only second grader that and knowing that the school staff, they see hundreds of second graders. So just knowing that they're able to kind of compare, is this what is typical for a second grader in our school in this environment, or is this not typical? And really listening to that too, because there are some things that sometimes we think might require more support, But actually, that's pretty typical for 8-year-olds right now. And that's what we see in our classrooms and across all of our 108-year-olds right now. So just kind of keeping that in mind too, tapping into their expertise and their knowledge of what that looks like for an 8-year-old. And then just remember that you don't have to carry this weight alone. So if you are working for you, or if you are advocating for your own child and with things like CLOVES or other unique things, it can feel very lonely at times, but just know that you don't have to carry that whole weight alone. That schools want your child to be safe, to be seen, and to be supported just as much as you do. So really bringing that unified front together to support the whole child is the ultimate goal. That's all I got. Are there any questions or anything I can help clarify or talk more about?
Jodi, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. So like my daughter has a 504 at school.
Mm-hmm.
And actually my son does too, but Kiki has CLOVES. And it was great seeing it, like I, having walked the process of accommodations and documenting that. It was neat to see it sort of from like a 1,000-foot level, right? Instead of being in it. So that was really valuable and interesting. I think the one question I jotted down while you were writing was, do you think that there's any, I guess, difference in how you would approach a kiddo who like is getting ready to go to middle school or is in middle school? And like, is it more important to have that more legal documentation at that level because there are so many more students and teachers have so many more students and things? Or I don't know, as you help families who are about to transition to upper grade, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it is really student dependent. So if the family finds more comfort in having it still in a 504 and legally documented, absolutely keep that. I always share too, in this really, I would ask about it because it's really going to depend on the school system. So I'm in a smaller school district. We have 5 elementary schools that feed into one big middle school. But we do transition meetings in the spring, just things that like you might not know school staff are doing. So we do transition meetings every year with our student services staff or our people service staff. So myself, that school social worker, school psych, our administrator, with the team that's going to be that at the next building where they have more school counselors and things like that to share. Here are the kids and here are the supports we have in place and here's some background. And then here's the person you call if you have any questions. So you're going to call me if you have a question about so-and-so. So we do some of those transitional things. Those aren't necessarily like legal things. It's just a part of our process where a legal document would certainly follow. So you would have a school psychologist that next school year reach out to you because legally they have to come back together and do that. But if that legal document doesn't follow for whatever reason, just know that those same things can likely be done at that next level. So pulling, communicating with the teacher, with the school counselor, with the staff about what those supports are that you're looking for. We typically, when we had 504 meetings in the spring, we would invite a team member from the middle school to come join us. So they're able to meet the family, start to build a connection with the kid if they're there, things like that. So that is something that can be done. I know that also happens with the IEPs. So they do meet and greets with the special education teachers before they're that next year, just to kind of get everybody on the same page. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I think the legal part of it helps for sure that it's going to stay on everybody's plate. But even without that, it's likely still on people's plates. And if not, it's for sure on your plate. And then you know how to kind of reach out and ask about that again.
Cool. That makes sense. No, that did answer my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Does anybody else have questions for Jodi? The good news is we have our social hour in Gather next. I'm going to drop that link in the chat. And then, yeah, so I think Jodi's going to join us over there.
Yep.
I will drop that link in the chat. Feel free to ask questions here if you'd like to, and we'll start transitioning over to Gather in just a few minutes. Also, the link to Gather's in your emails, your reminder emails and things. So feel free to grab it there, but for ease, I was going to put it in here too. So Jodi, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all over in Gather in just a few minutes.